All right, now that we have our lights in the scene, it's time to start talking about rendering. And we're gonna start talking about the render settings first. So just before we move on to the actual rendering, I'm gonna set up just the cameras. So I'm gonna set camera. I'm just gonna leave it as camera 1. You can call it shot 1, shot 2. I'm gonna leave it as camera 1, or yeah, camera 1. And I'm gonna create 2 cameras for this. All right, so I'm gonna create 2 cameras. I'm going to merge them. I'm gonna use a merge for this. And just to be safe, I'm gonna do a configure layer node here. I'm going to save this to just select the path. Set to, let's say, shot cameras USD. All right, so we have cameras there, and we have them here. We want to merge them with the layer here. We could just add it to this layer, but I kind of just like to just have these specific things like the sub layer to specific ports. But of course, you can connect more things here into the sub layer just to keep it readable. I'm doing this, and then this I have to change it again to inputs. And there we go. Now we have the cameras here in the drop down on the viewport here. We can select between them. Of course, they are just placed in the center of the world right now. So let's select camera 1. And we could also just create the camera from here on. Wait, there's no way to create it here. So let's just move the camera to the position that we want it. And I'm gonna do one that is gonna be like a top kind of view, and I'm gonna do another one that's closer to the table level. So this first one, I'm gonna make a 60mm lens, and I'm gonna have it be something like this. I want this to be a little bit from above. Just kind of seeing everything in one glance. Yes, I like that. I like that. So now let's go to camera 2. Let's unlock this. Just make sure that I'm on camera 2. Now camera 2 is going to be similar, but I'm going to put it more lower towards the and I'm gonna put the lower on the table level, and then I'm gonna put the focal length to 100. So it's just like a really big lens. I mean, there we go. It seems like it didn't change before for some reason. So now this is gonna be more kind of like this, kind of just a view like from the table. So we can even, if you want, just rotate it different. You can do your own shot if you want to. In my case, I have my layout kind of like focusing on this guacamole here in the middle. So I just want to keep that centered. And these guys are my safeguards, so my eye doesn't go out of frame. But this, so yeah, that's what I want, something like this. I do want to see a little bit of the table, just so I don't have this chiles, these jalapenos all the way on the bottom. I can even raise it a little bit more to have a little bit more space actually, and like that. So yeah, that's gonna be my second shot. Let's just move it a little bit over here. There. So this is gonna be shot 1 and shot 2. Well, camera 1, camera 2, and that's gonna be it for cameras. So as I mentioned about rendering before, you have your settings here in the viewport. If you go here to the viewport and press the letter D, this is where your settings are going to be. Of course, for the OpenGL viewport, there's no settings. But when we switch to one of the renderers, the settings will be populated here. Also, you can, if you don't like to press in the letter D, you can press this little eye icon here in the lower right part of the viewport here. So let's to start. Let's just start switching to one of the cameras. Let's just use camera 2 there, since we're over there, and let's switch to Karma here. And Karma, you can see it kicks in, and it's using that camera because that's the viewport we are on right now, right? So if you want to change the render status on Karma, you can see it's still rendering here. It's going 10%, etc. And it says that it's gonna be taking like 2 minutes to render this image. So if you don't want to render that much, if you're just setting stuff quickly and you want your machine not to be just rendering all the time, you can change your settings, of course. So also you can choose what to display here on the viewport. I'm not sure if I mentioned that before. And sometimes the viewport just goes crazy. I'm just going to change cameras. So to change the settings of this render, just press the letter D, and you can see now we have this properties here. There's a lot of properties here for the Karma setting. Well, there's not a lot. There's just the basics here. But also you can see here in this drop down, you can see there's a render settings. Also, if I didn't mention this before, there's a pause and render, restart render buttons here, or options. It's also great if you just want to pause it and just stay there, render, don't do anything until I tell you about. Until I tell you to start rendering, it stays there. You can see there's also a pause icon here, so you know that is happening. And you can also just click there to restart it, but you can't click on it to pause it. You have to go back here, pause it, and you can restart the render. If something is not updating and you know this should be updating, you can just click the restart render button here, and it should restart your rendering. All right, so if I restart my render here again, I can now press D and go here to the Karma properties, and I can say just render 4 pixel samples, and you can see now it's just going to be rendering really quickly. And it's going to get me to 100% or to 4 pixel samples really quickly, and that will just allow me to just work and maybe not tax my machine as much while I'm working. Sometimes you don't even notice, but your processor should be going in 100% while you're doing this. So if you don't want that, you can do this. You can also have this really nice disabled lighting option here. You can actually just navigate around really quickly with Karma. It's almost kind of like a OpenGL kind of viewport with no materials, which is cool. So this is the render settings. I am not going to go through the what these do exactly, because we're just gonna be here all day. But it's just render common render settings for most renderers. You can see these diffuse limits, how many bounces you're having of light. Reflection and refraction. You say if I reduce the refraction, we might have less refraction here on the glass and the reflections, etc. But yeah, it's basically standard stuff in most renderers right now. They all just do similar settings, have similar settings. So it's really simple right now to just manage renderers, because they are all pretty similar. Okay, so that is for the viewport. We will see now how well. Again, this will change if you switch to another renderer, for example, RenderMan, right? Now you have all the options of RenderMan here, and RenderMan starts doing this thing on the viewport here. But again, not gonna go through all the settings on RenderMan, because there are just like a lot of settings for RenderMan. One thing that might be useful for you to know is RenderMan has different integrators. You can change them. You can say this is just for rendering like occlusion. The BCM it's bidirectional renderer, which is really nice. There's also the unified, which is I think it's the newest one, and it's really cool as well. As you can see, all of these guys have different settings. So yeah, in this case, we're gonna be using the path tracer just because it's the most common one, and it's really simple. Here you just have your indirect samples, and if you wanna render more samples here, right now the samples are just basically infinite. I'm not sure how many samples it's rendering when you have this at 0. If you put this to let's say 4, it's gonna render 4 samples, and it's gonna finish really quickly. So the max sample is basically the limit, as we did on Karma, but yeah, I don't know the 0. It's basically, I'm not sure exactly what 0. How many when you have this default at 0. I'm not sure how many samples it's doing exactly. You can also change the minimum samples, etc. But that's all RenderMan specific stuff, which is gonna be changing for all of the renderers. Each one's gonna have the specific amount of samples they are doing, or the specific settings. Sorry. So let's move on to Karma again, and what we can do as well is have a separate render settings node. So there is a render settings. You can see there's several render nodes, and we're gonna see what they do. So now you can see we have a render settings here. You can name this whatever you want. Of course, this is Houdini. You can just name it whatever you want, but I'm gonna leave it at render settings 1. And here is where you set your resolution. One of the places that you can set the resolution of your camera. I'm gonna set this to HD basically. And here you can select which camera you're gonna render with. You can see I have camera 1 here. You can change this to be camera 1 or camera 2 just by put it here, camera 2. It doesn't show on the viewport here because the viewport has its own override. Also, to use these settings, you have to select them here. So before we do that, you can see we have a little bit of settings. They're not everything that you might expect here, but also there are specific tabs for each one of the renderers here. In this case, Arnold, RenderMan, Redshift, and Karma. And you can see this is all the render settings that you expect on the renderer. Sometimes less than that. Some other settings are in other places. For example, in RenderMan, sorry, there's some settings that you see in the render app that you don't have here. They are on the render geometry settings. But yeah, most of the settings should be here. This is if you know Arnold, you can see that this is the kind of the regular Arnold interface of settings, which is basically really simple. But let's say that let's switch to Arnold now and see what we are working with here. So now here with Arnold, we have this bottle that has not enough transmission depth here to clear that, or the ray depth. So in this case, we only have one render settings now, and that's the one we have selected. And in this case, we can either just modify it here in the render settings, and just can see it starts working there, or in this case, we can also go here and modify it here. Set this and modify it to 10. And this is gonna work. And the reason is because here you can see in the render settings, the default is actually render settings 1, which is the one that exists on the scene here. And even if we rename this, that's gonna be the default one because it's the only one on the scene. So as long as there is the first one, that is gonna be the one that is gonna be used. If you have another one, different one, let's say new, I'm gonna call this new, and or just here in the same branch, you can have them in the same branch, that's fine. Now here you can actually select between the two, and see which one you're using. Let's say, for example, in this one, we didn't have this. So if we change this to the default, which is 2 here, and we go here to the render settings, we might not, this render settings here, we can see this one is 2. And if we change this, now it starts taking this into account. And now the bottle, it's not using the other settings here. You can see it's using, it should be using this one. It should be using this one now, which is the one we have open here. And that is doesn't have the enough trace depth here for that. So you can have different render settings for different things. If you want to render just the glass with different trace depth, you can do that. You can have your settings for specific things, or for specific, like let's say the proxy version and the high-res version that you want to render. We are just going to be using this one for now. I don't think we're going to be using 2. So what I'm going to do is actually just set this transmission to what I want, because for Arnold I need that. Also, you can do that for, of course, for specific renders. Thus, you don't have to make one for the other renders. This can do the same. If we switch to RenderMan, for example, here in RenderMan, you can see we can change these settings, like the integrator that we changed before. You can see we can change to the occlusion one, the PCM, etc. here, and have the specific render settings. And are the settings that you can select for actually rendering your final image. That's why we need to have a specific node for this, and these settings will be picked up by the renderer, which is going to be the one that we're going to be rendering with, which in the case of Solaris is the USD render wrap here. See, this is a generic or a common render wrap that caches all the other renderers. You can see here there's a renderer option, and let's list all the delegates that you have installed. You will just being a common renderer or a common output for the renders. You can see there's not much settings here to select. They plug your render settings here, in this case the one that we have here, and then it just picks the settings from there. So basically you're setting up everything for this guy for this node just to output the final image and process whatever you actually set at this level, and other things that we're actually gonna set before these render settings. As I mentioned, some other settings are in a few different nodes. For example, for RenderMan, to get this glass to actually render, the setting is not here in the RenderMan properties. That is basically a geometry property. So if I go back to this tequila bottle here, there is this node, this called render settings, render geometry settings. So this geometry settings also has settings for other things you might be aware or you need to, or you are used to changing for geometry or for the output node, for the wrap. And you can see here in RenderMan, I selected this meshes here, and I added this max specular depth here, because if I don't, this is just going to be black because it doesn't have enough ray depth here there. So now if I just same thing, and if I move this to 10, it was going to be enough rays to cross over the glass and the water inside of the tequila inside. So same thing for other options, like for Arnold, if you want to set your type, your subdivision type for this object, if you want it to be subdivided at runtime, you can set it here. For Redshift, there's also all those common stuff. If you want to set your object ID or your cryptomat ID, you can set them here. I'm gonna switch this to OpenGL, so I'm not keep rendering. So yeah, all those other settings, if you don't find them in the render wrap on the render settings, they might be on the render geometry settings. And this is the visibility flags, the tessellation are here, the math, the proxies, etc. here. And for Karma, there's also settings specific for this object if you want to set them this way. For there's also some other light settings that we can control here. For example, for Redshift, we're going to be using these light groups for rendering specific lights. So yeah, if the places you will be finding your render settings will be in the render settings node, and the rest of them will be on the things that apply to geometry, or on the I lost the node, are on the render geometry settings. And they are specific for each renderer, of course. You can see there's the tabs for each specific one. Now, the last thing I want to say here is that, for example, you find that there is a Karma node, you will think that, oh, Karma has a specific node because it's side effects and they just made a specific node. Well, there's also a RenderMan node. So also RenderMan did their own basically node. And it's kind of has like the whole kind of thing. You have select the camera, the resolution. It even has, like in Karma, for example, you can see it even has all the render bars or the LPEs. But you're gonna learn that this is basically just an HDA, and we're gonna go more in depth in this in the next lesson. But yeah, you can just plug Karma instead of this here and render with this one. Your output, you can just set your camera resolution, the camera you want to use, the output where you're going to, the output picture here where you're going to output to, the AOVs, all the rendering settings are here as well. You can see it's kind of encapsulating everything. So you can also see here that there is a render settings path here in the node. So it's also creating a render settings node, and you can actually see it here in the scene graph here. There is the render settings is there, and this is the one being created by Karma. And we're gonna see more in depth about this render context here or scope here in the next lesson. But yeah, these are just, if you double click here on this, guys, you can see it's just an HDA and actually contains the US render route. That's the way to get stuff out of here, but they just contain stuff here. And even if you go inside here, there is the same nodes are here. You can see there's the render settings node is there. So it's just a way to have all this stuff in one single node. All right, so that's how you will manage your render settings.